Walk into any garden center this month and you will find them lined up on the clearance rack. The tired ones, half price, leaves scorched at the edges, the soil pulled away from the sides of the pot, and if you tip one out, the roots are wound around and around in a tight little spiral, searching for somewhere to go and finding nothing but the shape of the pot. Most folks look at a plant like that and read the leaves. Sad leaves, sad plant, walk away. Or they feel sorry for it, carry it home, baby it through the fall, and bury it by spring anyway. Here is what almost nobody tells you. The leaves are the last thing you should be reading. The part that decides whether that plant lives for 20 years or dies by Thanksgiving is the part you cannot see, the roots. And right now, in the heat of late summer, those roots are running on a completely different clock than the rest of the plant. Learn to read that clock, and you can put 10 perennials in the ground this month that will come back every single year, on their own, long after you have forgotten you planted them. And there is one bag sitting in that garden center, the one they will tell you to buy for every hole you dig, that quietly cancels the whole thing. We will get to it, do not skip it. This is Golden Harvest, where we start with the mechanism and let the technique follow. Around here we say it every week. Feed the soil, not the plant. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are not going to look at a planting hole the same way again. So let me tell you what is actually happening under the ground right now, because this is the part the plant list videos skip right over. A plant runs on 2 clocks, and in late summer, those 2 clocks come apart. Above the ground, the plant is reading the light. The days are getting shorter, the sun is dropping lower, and the top of the plant is winding down for the year, slowing its leaf making, thinking about going dormant. That is the clock you can see. But down in the soil, there is a second clock, and it is running weeks behind the first one. Soil holds heat. All that warmth the ground soaked up through June and July does not just vanish the week the air turns cool. The University of Illinois Extension puts it plainly. In fall, the soil hangs onto its heat long after the air above it starts to drop. And that warm soil is exactly what new roots want. So while the top of the plant is quietly clocking out for the season, the roots are still on the job, still growing, still reaching out into the ground. And they will keep at it until the soil itself finally slips below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit and freezes over. Sit with what that means for a second. A perennial you plant right now is not spending its energy on leaves and flowers for you to admire. It is spending everything it has on the part you will never see. It gets a whole hidden autumn of root building, 6, 8, 10 weeks of quiet underground work before winter ever shows up. Now compare that to the spring planting most of us do out of habit. You buy the plant in May, you set it in cold, waking soil, and almost at once it has to throw its energy upward into leaves and buds, because that is what spring demands. It never gets that quiet season to build roots first. Then summer arrives and slams a half-built root system with heat and drought, and there you are, out every evening with a hose, keeping it alive. That is not a tough plant. That is a plant that never got its head start. That, right there, is the whole secret of plant it once and walk away. It was never really about the plant being tough. It is about giving the roots their season, the invisible one, before you ever ask the plant to perform. One honest note before we go further, because I am not going to hand you a date on the calendar and pretend it fits everyone watching. This is a soil temperature window, not a square on the calendar. If you garden up north in a cold zone, late August into September is your sweet spot. If you are down south, where the ground stays hot deep into fall, your window slides later, into October, even November. The rule that actually travels is this. Get these in the ground about 6 weeks before your first hard frost, so the roots have time to work. Check your local extension office and your USDA hardiness zone. They will give you your real frost date better than any video can, and it costs you nothing. All right, 10 perennials. But I am not going to just list them at you. I am going to group them by the kind of root they build, because once you can see the 4 shapes a root can take, you will understand exactly why each one thrives on neglect, and you will be able to look at almost any plant for the rest of your life and make a smart guess about how it wants to be planted. The first family, I call the anchors. These are the taproot plants. Instead of a spreading net of fine roots, they drive one thick central root straight down, like a carrot, like a fence post sunk deep. That taproot is a water reservoir and a storage tank all in one, and it is the reason these plants laugh at a dry August. It is also the reason you get exactly one chance to place them. A taproot does not want to be dug up and moved. Put it where you mean it the first time. First up, and this is my favorite plant on the whole list, blue false indigo, Baptisia. If you have never grown it, picture a shrub-sized mound, 3 to 4 feet across, with blue-green foliage and spikes of pea-like flowers in blue, or yellow, or creamy white depending on the type. The Perennial Plant Association named it their Plant of the Year, and it earns it. But here is why it belongs on a Golden Harvest video in particular. Baptisia is a legume, the same family as beans and peas, and legumes strike a deal with the soil. Down on their roots they grow little nodules, and inside those nodules live bacteria that pull nitrogen straight out of the air and hand it to the plant as fertilizer. Read that again. This plant does not sit around waiting for you to feed it. It partners with the soil to feed itself, and when its leaves drop each fall, some of that nitrogen goes right back into the ground for everything growing nearby. That is feed the soil, not the plant, written into a plant's own body. You will never buy a bottle that does what a Baptisia root does for free. Give it full sun, give it lean soil, and give it patience. A taproot plant spends its first year or two building downward before it puts on much of a show up top. By year 3, it is a fixture. A Baptisia can outlive the person who planted it. Number 2. Butterfly weed. Asclepias tuberosa. This is the orange one, the native milkweed with flat clusters of blaze orange flowers that monarch butterflies build their whole lives around. It, too, sinks a deep taproot, which is why it shrugs off drought once it is settled, and why, again, you plant it and then leave it be. Dig it up to move it, and you will most likely lose it. Here is the honest part, because I will not sell you a fairy tale. Butterfly weed is slow out of the gate and late to wake in spring. So late that every year, gardeners assume it died over the winter and dig it up right before it would have come back. Mark where you put it. Give it full sun and poor, well-drained ground. Do not baby it with rich soil or heavy watering, because that is how you rot the taproot. Plant it right, and you have handed the monarchs a filling station and handed yourself a plant that asks for nothing. Number 3 closes out the anchors. Sea holly, Eryngium. This is the strange, wonderful one, steel blue and spiky, like a thistle, designed by a jeweler. Almost nobody plants it on purpose, and that is a shame, because it might be the single toughest thing on this whole list. Sea holly wants the spot you have given up on. Poor, sandy, sharp draining, baking in full sun. Rich soil is not a kindness to this plant. It is a slow death. Feed a sea holly well, and it grows floppy, weak, and short-lived. Starve it a little, and it stands up straight and metallic for years. Same taproot rule applies. Pick the spot once, because it resents the shovel the moment it is established. Do you see the thread already running through this first family? Every one of them punishes generosity. The kindest thing you can do for a taproot plant is give it a hard spot and then get out of the way. Second family, the mats. Instead of one deep root, these plants weave a dense, fibrous net of fine roots just under the surface, spreading wide and tangled. A taproot is a well. A fibrous mat is a sponge. That net grabs and holds every bit of moisture in the top layer of soil, and it knits the ground together so it does not wash or blow away. These are your soil builders. Number 4. Threadleaf blue star, Amsonia. In spring, it gives you soft, powder blue starflowers, but that is not why it is here. It is here for October. When most of the garden has gone brown and given up, this plant turns into a 3-foot mound of the most electric golden yellow you have ever seen on a perennial. It rivals any tree in your yard, and it holds that color for weeks. The Perennial Plant Association crowned this one plant of the year too. Fine, feathery foliage, a fibrous root system that settles fast in warm fall soil. Deer walk right past it, and once it is in, it keeps its neat, rounded shape for decades without flopping. Plant it and forget it. Your future self meets it again every single autumn. Number 5, little blue stem. Now, I know. The moment I say ornamental grass, half of you reach for the remote. Stay with me, because this native prairie grass is doing more underground than almost anything in your beds. Its fibrous roots go deep, and I mean deep, anchoring the soil and pulling carbon down into the ground where it belongs. Above ground, it is a cool blue-green all summer. Then it catches fire in fall. Coppery, russet, wine red, glowing when the low sun hits it. And it stands right through winter, giving your garden a backbone when everything else has collapsed into mush. Full sun, average to poor soil, zero fuss, and the birds work the seed heads all winter long. Number 6. Catmint, Nepeta. Not catnip, its better-behaved cousin, though the cats may still come pay their respects. This is the low, soft, gray-green cloud of a plant that erupts in a haze of lavender-blue flowers, and then, if you shear it back once around midsummer, does the whole thing over again. Its fibrous roots establish in a hurry, which is exactly what you want from a fall planting. Lean soil, full sun, drought tough, and the deer and rabbits leave it alone. If you have a hot, dry edge along a walk or a driveway, catmint will pour over it like water and bloom for months while asking you for nothing. Third family, the colonizers. These spread by rhizomes, underground stems that creep sideways just below the surface and send up fresh shoots as they travel. A taproot goes down, a mat spreads fine, but a rhizome marches. Plant one, and in a few years you have a patch, then a colony. A plant that quietly fills its own gaps and, in a way, plants itself. Free plants from the ones you already own. Number 7. Siberian iris. And I will point you straight at the old variety called Caesar's brother, deep violet blue, because it is nearly indestructible. Forget everything you have suffered with bearded iris, the rot, the borers, the digging and dividing every few years. Siberian iris does none of that to you. It builds a grassy, upright clump that looks sharp all season, throws elegant flowers in late spring, and then just quietly gets a little bigger and a little better every single year, with no help from you. I know gardeners with clumps that have sat undisturbed, undivided, unbothered, for well over a decade. Average to moist soil, full sun to a little shade. This is about as close to set it and forget it as a flower gets. Number 8. Goldenrod, Solidago. And now I have to stop and defend this plant, because I know exactly what half of you just thought. Absolutely not. That is the weed that wrecks my sinuses every September. So let us set the record straight, because this is one of the most stubborn myths in all of gardening. Goldenrod does not cause your hay fever. It never did. Here is the mechanism, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Goldenrod is pollinated by insects, so it makes heavy, sticky pollen built to cling to a bee's leg, far too heavy to float on the wind and reach your nose. The real culprit blooms at the very same time, standing right next to it. Ragweed. Ragweed is pollinated by the wind. It throws clouds of fine, light pollen into the air by the billions, and that is what ends up in your sinuses. But ragweed's flowers are dull and green and invisible, while goldenrod is putting on a blazing yellow show. So for 100 years, goldenrod has taken the blame for a crime ragweed committed. The University of Illinois Extension and the folks at the University of Georgia will tell you the same thing. Goldenrod is innocent. Plant it. It is a rhizome-spreading, late-season nectar bar that feeds every bee and butterfly in your neighborhood when almost nothing else is blooming, and it comes back stronger every year. The last family is a pair of specialists, one for your wet spot and one that breaks all the rules. Number 9. Joe Pye weed, Eutrochium. Every yard has that one low corner where water sits and everything you plant there sulks or drowns. Joe Pye weed has been waiting for that corner its whole life. This is a big, statuesque native. It can stand 5, 6, even 7 feet tall, topped in late summer with great dusky mauve domes of flower that butterflies cover so thickly the whole plant seems to move. It actually wants the damp ground that rots your other perennials. Its roots relish steady moisture. Put it in that soggy problem spot, in full sun to part shade, and you have turned your worst square of yard into the busiest pollinator stop on the block. And number 10. If you have watched Golden Harvest before, you knew this one was coming. The peony. There is a reason peonies get handed down like heirlooms. A healthy peony can outlive the house it grows beside, blooming every May for 50, 70, 100 years. But the peony plays by one strict rule. And get it wrong and you will wait a decade for flowers that never come. It comes down to the eyes, those little pink-red buds on the crown of the root. And here is the mechanism nobody explains. A peony has to feel winter in order to bloom. Those eyes need a good stretch of cold to trigger next year's flower buds. That is simply how the plant is wired. So the eyes have to sit shallow, no more than 1 to 2 inches beneath the surface, close enough that winter's chill actually reaches them. Bury them deeper, or, and this one catches so many good gardeners, pile thick mulch right on top of the crown, or heap rich amended soil over it, and you have muffled that cold signal. The plant cannot feel winter, so it never gets the message to make flowers. It just makes leaves, year after year, while you stand there wondering what you did wrong. Iowa State and Penn State Extension both draw that line hard. Eyes no more than 2 inches down. Get that one detail right, and you have planted something that may well outlast you. Now, that bag I told you not to skip. Here is where I am going to argue with almost everything the garden center will tell you. So lean in. You have dug your hole. You are holding your beautiful new plant. And every instinct you have, and every tag on every plant, and every helpful soul in the bag's soil aisle, says the same thing. Mix in a big scoop of rich compost or potting mix, so the roots have something nice to grow into. It feels like kindness. It is, quietly, one of the most common ways good gardeners hobble their own plants. Here is the mechanism. When you fill the hole with soft, rich, store-bought mix, you have built the roots a luxury apartment inside a pocket of native ground. And the roots do the rational thing. They stay. They circle around inside that comfortable pocket instead of pushing out into your real soil, which is firmer and less pampered. Clemson Extension describes it exactly. The fluffy amended soil is so different from the native ground around it that the roots refuse to cross the line, and in heavy clay, the wall of the hole can even glaze over hard and smooth, like the inside of a clay pot, sealing them in. A couple of years on, you have a plant whose entire root system is the size and shape of the hole you dug. Prone to circling, easy to topple, never truly anchored, and it gets worse when it rains. Water races through that fluffy pocket, then stalls the second it hits the tighter native soil, so the hole fills up and holds water like a bathtub, and the roots sit there and rot. You did that. With kindness. With a bag you paid good money for. The research here is not new, and it is not fringe. The University of California and Clemson Extension land in the very same place. For most soils, skip the amendment. Backfill the hole with the same soil you dug out of it. Water is the best thing you can add. If your ground is truly awful, the fix is to improve the whole bed, wide and shallow, not to dig one rich little trap. And here is a trick worth knowing. Take your shovel and notch a few grooves down the sides of the hole. Rough it up. Give the roots some easy doorways out into the native ground. Now think about why you have never heard this before. A bag of amendment rings up at the register. Use the dirt you already have does not. Nobody can patent your native soil. Nobody can sell it back to you. So nobody stands at the end of an aisle recommending it. This is not some conspiracy. It is just economics. The best advice in gardening is usually the advice with no product attached to it, which is exactly why it stays invisible. Feed the soil you have. Let the plant grow into the real world. So you have chosen right, and you have planted right. 3 last things can still undo it in the first 6 weeks, and each one makes sense the moment you think about it in terms of roots. Mistake 1. You water shallow and often. A quick 5-minute sprinkle every evening feels caring, but think about what the root learns. Water that only wets the top inch teaches the roots to stay up top, chasing it, right where the sun will bake them the first day you skip. Instead, water deep and seldom, a long, slow soak 2 or 3 times a week that carries water down 6 to 8 inches. You are not watering the plant. You are teaching the roots to go down and find their own water. Deep water grows deep roots. Mistake 2. You smother the crown. A couple of inches of mulch around a new perennial is one of the best things you can do. It holds moisture and keeps the root zone from cooking. But there is a line. Pile that mulch up against the stems, heap it over the crown, and you have recreated the very same too-deep problem we just talked through with the peony. You bury the part of the plant that needs air, and for some plants, needs to feel the cold. Mulch the ground around the plant. Leave the crown itself open to the sky. Mistake 3. You mistake the calendar for the clock. Everything today comes back to soil temperature, not the date on the wall. Push these plantings too late, past your window, and you are gambling the whole thing on a mild winter that may never come. If your first frost is 6 weeks out, plant this week. Do not wait for a tidier weekend. Now I want to hear from you, because this channel has taught me more than any book ever has. 2 questions. First, what is your hardiness zone, and which of these 10 are you putting in this fall? Drop it in the comments so we can all see what is thriving where. What sails through a Georgia winter is not what sails through a Minnesota one, and the map you all build down there in the comments is worth more than anything I can say up here. And second, the honest one. When you planted your last tree or shrub, did somebody tell you to fill the hole with bagged soil? Did you do it? I am not asking to scold anybody. I am asking because I want to know how deep this piece of advice runs, and whether your amended plants actually did better or worse than the ones you just backfilled plain. Tell me, I read these. Here is what I hope you carry out of all this, and it is bigger than a plant list. We are trained to garden for the part we can see, the bloom, the leaf, the thing that photographs well this week. But everything that lasts in a garden is decided down where you cannot look. In the dark, in the soil, on a clock that runs slower and truer than the one on your kitchen wall. The plants that come back for 20 years are not the ones you fussed over. They are the ones you planted honestly, into real ground, and then trusted enough to leave alone. There is a kind of faith in that, putting a taproot into the earth in the heat of August, and believing in the quiet work you will never see. That is the whole craft, right there. If this changed the way you look at a planting hole, that is the whole reason I make these. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next one finds you. Next time, I am walking through how to combine these 10 so you get color from the first thaw straight through hard frost, with no gap in between. This is Golden Harvest. Feed the soil, not the plant. I will see you in the next one.